Welcome to How to Mitigate Cultural Bias in Market Research. I'm delighted to welcome all of our attendees today, as well as our presenters, Michelle Sacker, Chief Operating Officer at Fold & Company, and Yusuf Ahmad, Head of Methodology and Director of Insights at Phronesis Partners. Today's webinar will last approximately 1 hour. The first 45 minutes will be a presentation by Michelle and Yusuf, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Since our attendees' mics are muted, please feel welcome to use the chat or questions box to communicate with the organizers, and all of your questions will be shared with the presenters who will respond to them during the Q&A at the end. I also want to remind you that this event is being recorded, which means that after the event, we will share a replay as well as the slide deck that gets presented today. So without any further ado, I will pass the mic to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Elaine. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all who are joining today. A little bit about Fold. Fold & Company, we help our clients understand the externalities of the marketplace. And oftentimes that needs to be followed up with some market research. So what we do as market researchers is try to interpret and understand the results of what we put out. And oftentimes we actually need to think about, are there any cultural differences among our respondents that might be impacting the results that we see? And that is the topic of our webinar today. So this webinar today will cover 5 sections. The first, we're going to talk about why it is so important to understand cultural differences when we're engaging in market research, but in general for our strategies as executives in business, whether it's within one market or across the world. The second section, we're going to actually talk about what some of those differences might be, both in the substantive content of culture itself, as well as in differences in the response styles of our respondents. And then in section 3, we're going to tackle that first part about differences in substantive content, and we're going to discuss how to detect and adjust for those. In the 4th section, we're going to actually tackle that second piece, which is detecting and adjusting for differences in response styles. And in the final section, we're going to introduce you to 3 important frameworks to account for cultural differences. So let's get started. Why is it so crucial to understand cultural differences? So what we're going to do today is actually talk about a few well-known business cases which highlight why it's important to think about the differences in cultures in various markets and the consequences of ignoring it. The first case study we're going to talk about is McDonald's in China. So McDonald's entered China just a few years after KFC entered the market, but they had vastly different results. McDonald's had a much lower revenue per store and didn't really take to the market, and their expansion was not nearly as wide and significant as KFC's was. So what were the key differences here? 3 things that KFC did differently that really impacted their success. The first thing they did was they actually hired locally for their management. So people who really understood the market and what it meant and had the connections in the network there, which helped them with the second thing they did, which was really partner with a lot of local companies and so people were more receptive to them there. And thirdly, one of the things that probably is one of the most crucial things they did was actually really consider regional tastes in food of their local market. So they actually had types of items in China that you wouldn't find elsewhere in other markets. That was in stark contrast to what McDonald's did, where they came in with sort of a typical American fast food restaurant, and it didn't go over nearly as well. And they had to work on that, over many years to try to counter that initial market entry. So when they entered India, for example, they learned their lesson and they came in with some more regional types of items on their menu, as you can see here at Magalu's Tikki. Another very well-known case study is that of Walmart in Germany. So Walmart, as we all know, is an extremely successful mass market retailer in the United States, but it's also had quite a bit of success in places around the world. It did not succeed in Germany. In fact, Walmart pulled out of Germany in 2006. So what were the reasons from a cultural perspective that might have impacted Walmart's success? Well, there are a few things. So when we think about Walmart in the US, we know that shoppers love the convenience. They drive to the store, to the Walmart, and it's really one-stop shopping. They can get anything for their home, they can get clothes, different activity, things for different activities, and there's a large supermarket. So it has everything they need, and US shoppers really like that convenience. In Germany, however, that was not typical. People tend to shop to their stores to pick things up. They'll go to a variety of different stores, and they also will actually enjoy buying from their local brands. And so Walmart didn't take that into consideration when thinking about stocking the shelves. The other the other thing that they didn't take into account in Germany is actually this issue of sustainability and environmental consciousness, which is very, very important to German shoppers. So when Walmart stocked its shelves in Germany with things that had like single-use plastics, that really didn't go over very well with the German shopper. And finally, this might be kind of interesting, but from a cultural perspective, Walmart is known to present service with a smile, and they train their employees to do that and to welcome guests, guests as they enter the door. And that didn't go over well in Germany either. And German shoppers were sort of suspicious why they were being approached by various people. So all in all, it was not a success. And as I mentioned before, Walmart pulled out of Germany in 2006. There are some other examples where it's not just necessarily thinking about market entry, it's about communications and language. So this example is what I like to call lost in translation. So Pepsi had this wonderful slogan that we all know, Pepsi brings you back to life. Well, of course, they don't physically bring you back to life, it's sort of metaphorically. They reinvigorate you, they've got this great energizing drink, but this was translated literally. And in China, it had basically it had the nuance or understanding of Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the grave. So there was no classic sort of cultural reference to this bringing you back to life in China, and as a result, this was a big misfire, especially in a culture where really there's a lot of reverence for ancestors and and this didn't go over very well at all. So the language translation and connotation is extremely important to take into consideration. And that communication is not necessarily just limited to words. So there are also non-linguistic cues. So back to China, which seems to be a very good example for us today, red really means something auspicious, very sacred. It's leveraged, the color red is leveraged for weddings and for the Lunar New Year. And so it has a very different connotation in other markets, for example, in Italy, where it might be associated with speed and high octane sports and energy. So these are some examples of why it's so important to think about cultural differences and what can happen when you don't take those into account. So how do we need to think about that then when we're actually designing our cross-cultural survey research? So there are a number of different biases that we might encounter. So I'm going to go over a few questions first to think about, both in terms of the content and then in terms of the questions that we might ask and how we ask those questions. So first of all, in terms of thinking about the differences in culture, in substantive culture, some of the questions we may ask ourselves are we measuring what we wanted to measure? Have we included all the relevant items for measuring a construct? Are respondents using the same frames of reference? And are there systematic differences in how a question is understood and interpreted? There's that question of language again. In terms of understanding differences in response styles, we should really ask ourselves before entering a market, is there a systematic tendency to overreport or underreport in any culture groups? And by the way, this is not necessarily just across different countries, it could be within a country itself. Are there systematic differences in the variability of responses? Is there a systematic difference in response rates to particular questions? Let's dig a little further. So when we're thinking about differences in cultural content, some things we need to think about, for example, are differences in perceived needs. Sometimes, the actual motivation for purchase is very different in different markets. So Whereas in some markets, functionality of a product might be really important. If you think about a smartphone, the idea of either having a button or a touch screen or a full screen might make a difference to a consumer, but in other cases, it's just simply a question of aspiration. So the shopper wants to have the latest and greatest, so it doesn't matter if the functionality is improved or if they prefer something from an older version. They may want to buy that newer version simply to show it as a status symbol. There could be differences in collective and individualistic appeal of marketing messages, and that's really critical because in some markets, being individualistic, standing out, working on your own might be valued more than in other cultures and communities where being in sync with others, whether it's in the workplace or within your family or community, are actually much more important. We absolutely have to take consumption behavior into account when designing our survey instrument because consumption patterns may differ from occasions, different holidays that are celebrated, to frequency, to practices of in-home versus out of the home and office. So all of these need to be considered before designing a survey. Time and patience. Oftentimes we think about, have you ever made an impulse purchase or an impulse buy? So there are certain cultures where that is more typical, and then there are certain cultures where really researching your purchase, waiting for a discount is really much more accepted practice. And another substantive difference in culture might be in investment behavior. So there are various groups might have differences in risk propensity. Some might be a little bit more risk taking and some might be more risk averse. And we need to think about that when designing our survey. So now we're going to think a little bit about the difference in responses. They can be either substantive or in nature, and they also might have to do with the scale itself. So let's think about a couple different areas. Number one, the substantive difference in cultural communication style. So in some cases, disagreeing openly or vehemently agreeing might be more acceptable or almost expected of people. And in other cases, people may want to respond in a way they feel is more socially acceptable. Also, there might be certain cultures where you see some patterns in how people respond to scale. So like, is it a 1 to 5 or 1 to 7? And in some cases, people may be agreeing or being more on the positive side. And in some cultures, people might be more on the negative side. And in some cultures, people might sort of vote straight down the middle. And we need to be aware of those before we go ahead and interpret the results of our survey. So here are some, and this is not an exhaustive list, but some things to think about, some substantive differences which may show up irrespective of the type of question. So the first one we see a lot in market research is the acquiescence bias. And that is the tendency for people to agree. And we have to watch out for that. Another one might be the social desirability context. And one example of a classic case of social desirability might be, for example, in the US, it was widely known that when people asked, when respondents were asked on surveys, which television channel do they watch? Of course, now there's more streaming, but people might have answered in a mix of their channels that they watched or networks that they watched. They might have added in PBS or public television or educational TV. And they may actually not watch too much of that TV, but they want to give the impression that they are watching educational TV. So that is a social desirability bias example. Another one might be the question comprehension bias. It is critical, especially when thinking about different cultures within a market or in different languages, to really make sure that the question is understood the way you meant it to be understood so that you can interpret the results appropriately. And another example might be response rates bias. And you might see this, for example, in demographic questions where people may not want to respond to questions about marital status or their income levels. And in which case you are going to have some holes when you come back, but these are things to be aware of. And in terms of bias that shows up in scale questions, a couple things to think about are what we talked about before. So there may be some tendencies in some cultures to respond, in the extreme. And then there might be some cultures where people provide kind of mid-level responses. And you really need to know that when you're interpreting results. So you may see one market, for example, where people are wildly favorable and they're giving you very, very high positive response rates. That is not necessarily an automatic, let's enter this market right away because we'll have wonderful success there. You really have to take that into consideration, which culture is responding in which way. And then there's this question of reference bias. So to give an example of reference bias, if I'm asking the question to the respondent, are you healthy? Do you consider yourself to be healthy? So if there's a person who might live in an area where there's sort of a high mortality rate or a lot of obesity or endemic chronic diseases, and somebody who doesn't have any of those might consider themselves to be very healthy, even if they may not eat very well and they don't exercise a lot, still comparatively speaking, their reference might indicate that they're healthy and they may respond that way. And similarly, in other communities where people are really, really active and working out 7 days a week and multiple times a day, and they're eating on a purely very healthy diet, somebody who actually gets regular exercise and might exercise 3 or 4 times a week and eat pretty well might consider themselves to be not that healthy because their reference point is different. So we need to really think about those things when we consider our responses. So now I'm going to turn it over to Yusuf, and he's going to talk about and tackle how to identify and adjust for substantive cultural differences.
Thank you, Michelle, for taking us through the different types of cultural differences that we might encounter in a way that impacts the results of our surveys, or even impact neutral survey design. So we will now focus on both of these two types of differences, which is substantive differences as well as scale use differences. Our framework for dealing with that is prepare for it, detect it, well, that's once the data comes in, and deal with it if it is found to be to be present and significantly influencing results. We'll first look at substantive bias, and here we look at two ideas: construct congruence and anchoring vignettes. Anchoring vignettes is a technique. Construct congruence is an idea that would require some techniques for dealing with it. The first, sorry about that. We often use more than one item. We use market research scales, more than one items to measure a single construct, which is expected, which we think is broad in its content, so that it cannot be captured by a single item. Now, when that happens, what we need to ensure is that the same concept is measured equivalently across different cultures or different cultural groups. Not only that, now to deal with that, we need to deal with it while preparing for the research. And here, sometimes background research, established results are helpful. For example, in Australia, amongst Australians, trust is more task-based, while in India, trust is more relationship-based. And that would hold for a lot of Western cultures vis-a-vis Eastern cultures, just speaking broadly. US respondents have been found to be more likely to use extreme values in scales than East Asian respondents, who tend to be more conservative in terms of the scale points that they use. Now, there is published research, there are historical research. We also have, regular research that is published on a regular basis. For example, we have provided 2 links there, which you will find in your PowerPoint, in the PowerPoint that we send you at the end of the presentation of the webinar. We have Hofstede's dimensions of cultural difference, individualism versus collectivism, power distance, etc. And we have scores on that for different countries, which is collected by an organization. We have Erin Mayer's culture mapping tool, where she compares a lot of cultures based on her own surveys. Of course, that requires more validation, but some amount of data is available. Now, when such concepts are not available, we might want to use establish scales for measuring this. For example, for measuring individualism versus collectivism, or indulgence versus restraint, or uncertainty avoidance, that is the a propensity towards risk, and build them into our questionnaires. The offshoot of that is when the data comes in, we can actually compare scores across cultures, and we will see how that can be done and sometimes how that can be challenging, and use that to derive insights. For example, we may find that scores are low in a particular culture or tend to be towards the midpoint when background research suggests, for example, our question was, how willing are you or how receptive people in that culture are to a certain product? And we find that background research shows that that particular product should do well in that particular culture or country, for that matter. And we find that the scores are low. So, or low, as in they tend to be centered around the middle point. And our other questions in the questionnaire tell us that that culture is also very collectivist. So we have one way of qualifying the output that we get. But more, also importantly, using these scales can point towards potential bias in scale use. For example, individualist cultures are likely to give higher ratings on questions which ask for self-evaluation on positive attributes than cultures which are more collectivist, where standing out may seem inappropriate. Now, talking about construct congruence, when we talk about measuring things like the Akers brand personality scale using the Big Five, or consumer ethnocentrism, where we have, which is a single construct, usually measured as a single construct, established 17-item scale available for the United States at least. We're using different items to measure a construct. Now, most market researchers nowadays use formative measurements, where we say that we need to ensure that all aspects of a particular construct or a construct needs to be, or dimension needs to be captured in our scale. Now, when that happens, when we use such measurements, what we might find is that scales do not transfer equivalently across cultures. So some measurements or some aspects of a particular construct may be left out in one culture if we tend to use the same established scale from another, established in another geography or another culture, and we try and import it here. Which there are ways of detecting it. We do not want to go deeply into that, but usually, for multi-item scales, we will look at exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory factor analysis. And for single-item scales, we will look at Cronbach-Sulfur to see whether all those items hang together and are indeed measuring one thing instead of many. Now, the way to prepare for any, to avoid any surprises, after data collection would be to adapt the scales initially through pilot testing, through qualitative insights. So at least we have a range of items, some of which may drop off in the final analysis, but we are not short of items for at least capturing certain aspects of a construct, like consumer ethnocentrism in Japan. Vis-a-vis consumer ethnocentrism in Italy. What might work for Italy might not work for Japan. Health consciousness, what might work for Italy might not work for Japan, and we might be, or consumer sensitivity to ESG. So we might end up leaving certain aspects of a construct unmeasured, which actually impacts the validity of our measurements themselves. Now, what we have said is just skims the surface. Rigorous testing of construct equivalence at least when we are using, reflective measurements, like in the academic literature, for example, it requires the use of multi-group confirmatory factor analysis, which we do not want to get into because we want to keep the, the reach of the webinar fairly wide. Moving forward to, an example of this. There is a 5-item risk propensity scale that was established in the US, which was tested by a group of researchers in China using 3 different stakeholder groups. Now, the US scale is measured using those 5, tick marks, green tick marks, those items there. I would like to take chances, although I may fail to earn greater rewards, I'm willing to take higher risks. Some of them are, framed negatively, and they will be reverse scored later, and we'll see why that is also a good idea. But when those items were used, now 3 items that were used in the US study were actually dropped off as not contributing to the measurement of the construct, which is general risk propensity. When this same scale was transported to the US, the researchers found that the 5 items do not perform well. The Cronbach's alpha was 0.42. 0.62 is the traditional, cutoff point suggested by Nullally a long time back. 0.62, 0.7, 0.6 also is used by researchers. Now, what they found, however, is that if they take the extended scale, include the items that were dropped off, then 1, 2, 4, 5, and 8 gives a good measurement for China, where the Cronbach's alpha is acceptable. Now, of course, if they were doing the same study in the US and China, they used the same scale in the US, and they found that, well, it performs reasonably well in the US, even though it does not perform as well as this 5-item scale here. So they decided to go with these 1, 2, 4, 5, and 8 as the revised risk propensity, general risk propensity scale in the US and China in their study. So they could do that, of course, because they already built in these items which had earlier been dropped off the US study. Moving forward, one source of bias that it would be bias from our point of view, cultural differences from the response. If you look at it from the respondent's point of view, is that people may actually use different reference points while answering questions. It's a traditionally well-known thing in the use of market research scales. For example, if we ask people how healthy they are, people in the retired retired ladies and the elderly retired ladies in the United States, for example, would use a very different reference point for judging whether they are healthy or whether they are not healthy. The example here is, of course, for mobility or the lack of it, and as compared to some other cultural group. So the way to deal with this is to be able to use the self-reported measures as reflecting some real, as a real indicator of health would be to also use hypothetical situations involving hypothetical individuals. Here in this case, Maria, a 72-year-old retiree, is described as having a certain degree of difficulty in mobility. And the same scale is used to measure Maria's, is administered to understand how the respondents rate Maria in terms of difficulty in moving around as compared to themselves. Now, the reason why this is helpful is if we give for example, more than one such hypothetical situation involving more than one hypothetical individuals, and these situations are clearly distinguishable across cultures. Mobility is something that, where we might think that we might be able to, construct such hypothetical descriptions involving hypothetical individuals, where comparable groups in different cultures. Here, retired women, elderly retired women in the United States, let's say elderly retired women in China, the same degree of difficulty, at least we would expect the ranking to be, to be the same. If we frame those, what we call vignettes, those hypothetical descriptions correctly, or use sufficient care in describing, setting out those, those situations. Now here, the respondent has given Maria ratings of 1, 3, and 4 in terms of difficulty in mobility, and she gives herself a rating of 2, right? And now what we would do is we would combine these two ratings into an ordinal rating, right? An ordinal comparison. Market research scales are often used as scales by market researchers, reporting means and standard deviations over them. So here, what we have done for this respondent, she gives herself a rating of 2, she gives Maria a rating of 1, and Lucia a rating of 3. So we would say, if she gave herself a rating equal to that of Maria, we would call that a 2. Since she gives herself a rating between Maria and Lucia, we call that a 3. If she had rated herself a 3, we would have given her a score of 4. So this is how we transform these two ratings into a single scale, which has more definitive real-world content, and which is where it's easier for us to describe what a 3 or a 4 or a 5 means. Of course, this particular individual cannot give, cannot score below Maria, but someone else who scores Maria a 2 and gives herself a 1 would have scored herself below Maria and would have scored a 1. Now this method works if there are no ties in the ratings. Where there are ties in the ratings, more complex methods have to be used. Hierarchical ordered probit has been used, and there are specific packages in R, for example, that help us, do this well. And in those instances where there are ties, we just need one anchor, one anchoring vignette. The other thing that we need to remember here is that we have given the names Maria, Lucia, Sophia, so we need to ensure that these hypothetical individuals belong to the same cultural cohort that our respondents belong to. In this case, we are thinking about elderly, retired ladies in the United States belonging to the Hispanic community. So that is important, because otherwise a 72-year-old woman who might rate herself a 2 on a certain level of difficulty in moving around. But if she were to rate a 24-year-old athlete, of course, she would rate that as a very high degree of immobility. So for comparability, we try to ensure that the hypothetical individuals more or less belong to the same cohort as the respondents. We will move forward and discuss, scale use bias, having discussed difficulties in measurement when using difficulties, due to cultural differences arising due to substantive differences in that culture, including the use of different reference points, which is related to, long-term memory and the experience of the individual in terms of her social milieu. But before that, Elaine has a poll that she would like to administer. Elaine, please go ahead.
When comparing scores across groups of respondents, do you adjust for potential response style bias? Please select your answer. Okay. Well, interestingly, Yusuf, everyone in attendance said no.
Okay. So, Elaine, I have, okay. So let's then look at some of these methods that have been used. Give a brief overview. We won't delve too deeply into the methods, but we will give enough of an overview for you to go ahead and explore these methods and use them in your research, should you want to. And we have given a curated list of readings at the end. from both practitioners and academics that would probably provide a good background into the method. So we will look at, there are two types of approaches, basically. A response theory approach, which talks about how respondents go from looking at a question to answering it. So that usually goes from, the usual, process that has been suggested, hypothesizes that we look at a question, the respondents look at a question that, that triggers some long-term memories or sometimes short-term working memories. They match memory to the question information. They come to a judgment. They transfer that judgment to questionnaire, a survey paper, or respond to the investigator, or transfer it to online to our online survey. Now, an error can happen at any point. We are talking about a difference happening at the last point, even where the judgments are the same. The second is statistically more rigorous approach of finding out what is the bias, what is the actual difference in attitudes. We'll look at both of these briefly. But again, going back to our method of preparing, detecting, and dealing with cultural differences, it's not always bias, but if we don't deal with it, then it becomes bias for us. We're looking at acquiescence bias. We saw in the general propensity, risk propensity scale, that we were using both positive and negatively worded items. And that is because if we do it a sufficiently large number of times, and we find that people respond positively, irrespective of the content of the item, then they're either being inattentive, and we would like to rule them out through standard deviation checks that we usually use in surveys, or if it's not an online survey, or if it's an online survey and they have crossed the standard deviation check, then we have some suspicions of acquiescence bias, because they're saying that they take care of their health, that's their attitude, and they do not mind having fast food outside 3 times a week or 5 times a week. Then there is a problem there, and we'll look at, and that's how one way to prepare for it is to use positively and negatively worded items. For social desirability bias, we often rely on a background desk research. We can rely on qualitative interviews or observation to understand what the sources of such bias may be in responding. But one other method is that which we will see is the use of behavioral items. For example, a usage frequency or a consumption question, in addition to any attitudinal questions, so that the behavioral frequency, as we saw in the earlier example regarding fast food, using fast food, might act as a check against the initial response, and we can at least have some suspicion of social desirability bias once the data comes in. Question comprehension bias, again, pre-testing the questionnaire, pilot surveys, talking to experts is important, and this can influence surveys very, very severely. An example is a study in the United States amongst women around induced abortion. Now, it was found that women belonging to lower economic classes, lower socioeconomic strata, belonging to having lower educational levels, often misunderstood induced abortion as any abortion which they did not want, which was involuntary, because then it was induced by nature, whereas the intent of the researchers was to look at medically induced abortion. Fortunately, they had other questions in the questionnaire that allowed them to, understand that there is a misunderstanding of the question. Other ways of dealing with it is, for example, extreme or mid-response bias. Using 10-point scales usually, ends up giving lower incidence of such bias than using 7-point or 5-point scales, where where nuance is missing, and especially 5-point scales, where you just have 2 points for positive and 2 points for negative. If the scale is balanced. Reference bias, which we have already seen, and where we have said that anchoring vignettes is a good way to proceed, provided we understand that this cannot, the methodology might end up becoming, the techniques might end up becoming very, sophisticated, and it would not be possible to do that if we have anchoring vignettes for every attitudinal question. But if we have a set of related questions, all of them, for example, measuring the health consciousness or sensitivity to ESG, then we can run this if we have 5 items measuring ESG, and we can use a single set of anchoring vignettes to carry out the analysis. The placement of questions, the usage of proxy, indirect estimates, these are all things that market researchers often include in their surveys when they believe that a certain section of the population may not want to answer certain parts of the questionnaire. Moving forward, I'm slightly conscious of time here, so I will. How do we then, we have prepared, now how do we detect such bias? So this is an exploratory analysis methodology. The first thing we do is that we take similar items across the questionnaire, the same scales, and for each respondent, we calculate his mean and his standard deviation across all those items. Now here we are looking at extreme response bias, and we are using the second point here. The second step is we were looking at extreme response bias, and this is from a study that we did, and it was a study in 5 countries. We looked at what proportion of respondents give extreme scores more than 50% of the time, that is to more than 50% of 48 questions, and what proportion gives scores, extreme scores of 1 and 7, this was a 7-point scale, less than 50% of the time. And we did a univariate percentage comparison across the columns, test of column proportions. We see here that France, Italy, and Germany, all of them have higher proportion of respondents answering and giving extreme scores more than 50% of the time than South Korea. France and Germany also have a higher proportion of respondents giving extreme responses more than 50% of the time than Chinese respondents. And this agrees with what we know. China and South Korea have been traditionally collectivist societies, whereas France, Italy, and Germany are Western individualistic societies, more prone to standing out, more not uncomfortable with standing out and with giving extreme scores. The other, study, the same study, we also looked at variability bias. Now, we regressed the means and standard deviations of each respondent on demographic variables. Now, we have already included the scale variables, so we are regressing on the demographic variables. Now, these are the results for the mean regression. So we regress the mean on, say, country, age, educational, level, and educational level. And we found that if we look at country, we see that for all of these first 4 countries, which are the first 4 from the previous example as well, the 5th country serving as a reference point, because this is a discrete independent variable, categorical independent variable. So we find that all of them have higher means across all the items as compared to South Korea, the 5th country, whereas we did not find any significant differences in age, as we see from the p-values here. So, which leads us to suspect that there is not only difference in terms of extreme responses, there is actually a difference in terms of how people are using the rating scale, with the first 4 countries using the higher ends more than respondents from the 5th country. Exploratory analysis work can suggest but will not confirm scale use bias. And here we move to another method where we use, scale, where we try to correct for scale use bias. But before that, let me just go through how we standardize data and what we mean by standardization in this context. We just spoke about this is respondent 1 and 2, say they are the only respondents in a particular culture, and they have given these scores over 10 items. We calculate each respondent's mean, each respondent's standard deviation. We calculate the overall cultural mean, the overall standard deviation for the culture. These are all, say, 5-point scales. Now, in here, what we do is we say that, well, there is a difference in people are actually using different points of origin. That's why, when we say that there is a yay-saying bias, people, a 3.5 for a South Korean respondent is not the same as a 3.5 for a German or a US respondent. Let us take that part away and let's change the origin, which we also do because they are using different scales, different origins of measurement. So we change the origin to 0 by subtracting the mean from each response, the mean for that particular individual from each response. We then see that, well, let us also take away the variability. So we divide by the standard deviation for each individual, for each response, and we get these scores, say. So this is 0.64 is 1 divided by 1.56, etc. Then we do both together, and we say that we will take the mean, we'll take the differences from the mean and divide by the standard deviation. This is what we call standardization. And this leads when we do it across respondents, we call that ipsitization. So we have, researchers have used, commercial researchers and also academic researchers in cross-cultural psychology have used within subject standardizations. They've also used within culture standardizations, where instead of subtracting 4 from every response of this respondent and 4.10 from every response of the second respondent, we just subtract the culture mean. And here we just divide by the culture standard deviation. Now, the first method, and we can do both. We can do the second followed by the first. Now, the first method has been shown to have differences. It's like you compare the mouse's tail in length compared to the other parts of its body, and you compare the elephant's tail compared to the other parts of its body, and then you compare the length of whatever you have computed, and you say that the mouse's tail is longer than the elephant's tail. You're wrong, except that if we make it clear that the mouse's tail is relative to other parts of its body, and the elephant's tail is relative to other parts of its body. The other problems that arise from this is that the statistical action that the sum of deviations around the mean must always be 0. That leads to problems in correlation analysis, exploratory factor analysis, and basically variance covariance analysis methods. So these are some problems with this, but this is still a very popular method in social sciences, and especially in market research. And within culture, standardization is something that we prefer over within subject standardization because of what we just mentioned. Even though in the end it gives the same results when you have averaged across all respondents, the scores that you get are equivalent. But at least you're not starting off by saying through a method where individuals are no longer comparable. And if the cultures are no longer comparable, well, you can at least say we can use background research. This is a collectivist culture. It has lower scores. It has lower means. And that means they are more prone to using the middle ends of the scale. And this is what we seek, that their propensity to buy this item compared to their general profile of responses is high. So if we have, that is how we would need to interpret the scores relative to that, within culture, rather than comparing across cultures, which is a problem. There are approaches which allow us to do that. The modeling approach, these are more difficult approaches. We don't want to go into them deeply. We have included it here. Here, for example, Greenleaf suggested if you ask an attitudinal question, you also ask a behavioral question that is correlated with it, and you know the correlation. Here it's positive. Or how often do you have fast food? So the more the more important eating healthy is to a person, the less likely. So it's a negative he is to eat fast food outside the home, so negative correlation. Now you confirm the correlations. You calculate again respondent level means and standard deviations. You then run a particular behavioral item frequency. We have this paper in the references. It's not simple. It uses the attitudinal scores, the mean of the culture, the standard deviation, and the standard deviation of the entire sample of the culture. Then you take the signs of the coefficients depending on that equation. You take two coefficient signs and whether they are in the same direction or in opposite direction, we can decide as to whether there is a variability bias or a yay saying, nay saying bias. And then we can use weights to adjust for the bias and take out the attitudinal component. A rigorous method, computationally intensive. We can do this, have the same behavioral frequent item for a number of such attitudinal items. We'll move forward fast. We have another, and if you have questions, please to send them and we have another poll which Elaine has opened up.
Thanks, Yusuf. Of the following frameworks for understanding cultural differences, which are you familiar with? Please tick any that you're familiar with or none of the above. Thanks, Yusuf. Go ahead.
Do we have the results?
Yep. Everybody has heard of Hofstede.
Okay. So framework for thinking, we are looking at three frameworks. Hofstede's framework, which is the oldest, and where we have spoken about it earlier. He speaks about six differences in culture, six dimensions of cultural difference. Of course, these are broad dimensions. They are more granular in their content. They are more or less self-explanatory, except power distance, which is, of course, defined by the extent of distance that is maintained between people in different positions of power or influence or wealth in a society, and reflects in organizational structures, flat versus hierarchical. Time orientation, we have already discussed, short-term versus long-term orientation towards time. Erin Mayer's, which is the third day, is more or less similar to Hofstede's. She talks about things like feedback, negative or positive, communication, higher context, that's more nonverbal elements versus lower context, which is less nonverbal elements, and where what is said is what is intended. Decision making can be consensual. It can be at the hands of individuals. We have also provided a link to her website where she publishes her research comparing different countries. Of course, some of it is behind a paywall. McCracken's framework, more adapted to qualitative research. He talks about a culturally constructed world, where cultural categories are also culturally constructed. They are flexible and keep changing, so they are cultural groups in a way. Think about millennials and Gen Z. Transfer of meaning happens from the culturally constructed world to the world of goods, and from thence from goods to consumers. And there are possessions of rituals of culture, of possession, of grooming. For example, when we present something, or where we consume something in a restaurant, and there are rituals of dispossession as well. So it's more of a semiotic framework, looking at the signifiers and the signifieds of consumption. Looking at, culture is not always about geographic, and this is how we usually think of it, but cross-cultural does not always mean across geographies, and, it could be in the same country. For example, when we talk about consumption tribes, when we talk about Gen Z and millennials, when we do microsegmentation across, using social media data. And then when we again thinking back, and this harkens back to McCracken's, what McCracken said, we have emerging cultural groups, around gender identity, around sexual orientation, for example. That more or less brings me to the end of my section, and we will open it up to Q&A, and over to you, Elaine.
Actually, I think I'm going to be fielding the questions. Yusuf, can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Great, super. So yeah. I think, first of all, I think we probably have time for one, maybe two questions. So let's see what we've got here. So there is a question here which asked about, thinking back to that early case study. It says, you spoke about the translation fiasco for the Pepsi slogan. We often translate questionnaires from English to other languages. what kind of precautionary steps do you suggest for dealing with such issues in questionnaire translations? That's a great question. Of course, the most important thing is we don't use an auto translator tool. Leverage an actual person from that particular market to do the translation. That's step number one. I would say step number two is have a number of people in that market test it to make sure that they understand. And if they have any questions at all about what a question means, you can address it that way. And finally, I think you can actually go through an exercise of having a translator back translate, a different translator back translate from the original translated questionnaire back into English, if that's the original language, to make sure that actually the nuances are there and you are actually asking what you intend to ask. So that is, I think, how I would handle that. And then let's see, do I have time for, I think I have time for one more question. So let me bring another one here. It says, you spoke of collectivism and individualism as different cultural behavior types. Do you think that these differences matter less today with emerging markets integrating more and more with the global economic landscape and moving to what has been called a global melting pot? It's another terrific question. So as much as the internet and travel has brought us closer to each other, and we are not only traveling to different places, we're communicating with them, we're watching streaming shows from all over the world, there are still differences in cultural cultural behaviors. And it's not just across, as I mentioned earlier on, it's not just across the globe. It's even within one country, there are a lot of differences. We see among generations significant differences. For example, millennials and Gen Zers behave very, very differently in many ways. So I would say that as much as, in some ways we are a global melting pot, we're domestic melting pot, we're a regional melting pot, there are still cultural differences that we need to take into consideration when designing research and when interpreting research. I think that's all we have questions for. Let me turn it back to you, Elaine.
Oh, well, thanks, Michelle and Yusuf, for a great presentation. And thanks, everyone, for giving us an hour of your time to learn more about mitigating cultural bias. I'm going to wrap up the webinar now. There will be a brief poll at the end that we would love your feedback on to help us improve future events. And we'll send you an email after the event with a link to the replay and slides and contact information for Yusuf and Michelle. So thanks very much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.